The county fair was a spectacle of lights, sounds, and the smell of fried food that brought nostalgia to everyone who walked through its gates. For Jason, Emma, Lily, and Mark, it was supposed to be a night of fun, a break from the monotony of their everyday lives. They hadn't planned on going into the House of Mirrors, but the old, eerie structure caught their attention as they wandered through the fairgrounds. "Look at that thing," Mark said, pointing. "It looks like it's barely holding together." "That's what makes it interesting," Jason replied with a grin. "Come on, let's check it out." Emma hesitated, her eyes scanning the flickering lights and chipped paint that adorned the entrance. "I don't know, guys. It looks off." Lily shrugged, her curiosity getting the better of her. "It's just a funhouse, right? What's the worst that could happen?" With that, they approached the entrance, paying the bored attendant who barely glanced up as they handed over their tickets. As they stepped inside, the air shifted. It was cooler, and the noise from the fair seemed to vanish, replaced by an unsettling silence. The first mirrors greeted them with exaggerated distortions, stretching and twisting their images into grotesque forms. They laughed at first, pointing out each other's elongated limbs and distorted faces. But as they moved deeper into the maze, the atmosphere changed. The mirrors became less playful and more sinister, showing not just physical distortions, but something darker. Reflections that seemed to have a life of their own, staring back at them with knowing eyes. "Let's stick together," Emma suggested, her voice wavering as she looked at the endless corridors of mirrors ahead. But the maze had other plans. The corridors seemed to shift, guiding them in different directions. Jason turned a corner, and suddenly, he was alone. The mirrors around him reflected not just his distorted face, but scenes from his past, moments of anger, regret, and fear. His reflection began to move independently, sneering at him, showing him committing violent acts that made his stomach turn. "Guys," Jason called out, panic rising in his chest. But the only response was his own voice echoing back at him. Emma, trying to find her way back, was confronted with mirrors that showed her insecurities. Reflections of herself whispered taunts and accusations, their eyes full of malice. She could hear her friends' voices, but they were distant and distorted, as if coming from somewhere far beyond, the mirrors. Her heart raced as the mirrors showed her twisted versions of her friends, their faces cruel and mocking. Lily, separated from the others, began to feel the weight of the maze's isolation. The mirrors showed her visions of her friends leaving her behind, walking away without looking back. The more she ran, the more the mirrors seemed to shift, leading her in circles, trapping her in an endless loop of her own panicked face, reflected over and over again. Mark, trying to keep a brave front, started seeing his reflection age rapidly in the mirrors, his face withering into a skeletal mask. The horror of watching himself decay pushed him into a frenzy. He began smashing the mirrors, but each shattered piece only multiplied his reflection, showing hundreds of decaying versions of himself, all laughing at his futile attempts to escape. As the minutes turned into hours, the maze became a prison. The mirrors closed in on Jason, twisting his body in impossible ways, showing him visions of a future filled with violence and despair. His mind began to fracture, the reflections taunting him, until he could no longer distinguish between what was real and what was a twisted creation of the mirrors. Emma, exhausted and terrified, stumbled into a room where the mirrors lined every inch of the walls, floor, and ceiling. Her own reflection surrounded her, but each version of herself looked more twisted and malevolent than the last. They began to move on their own, closing in on her, their eyes filled with hatred. She screamed, but her voice was swallowed by the mirrors, the reflections smirking as they watched her crumble. Lily's panic reached its peak as she found herself in a corridor with no exit, the mirrors stretching infinitely in both directions. She banged on the glass, her fists leaving bloody smears, but there was no way out. Her own terrified reflection stared back at her, tears streaming down her face as she realized she was trapped in an endless nightmare. Mark's struggle ended in a similar corridor, his strength drained from the endless attempts to break free. He collapsed to the ground, surrounded by the decaying reflections that had once been his own face. The mirrors showed him his own death over and over again, each time more gruesome than the last. By the time the fair was closing, Emma and Mark stumbled out of the maze, their faces pale and their eyes hollow. They didn't speak, didn't look at each other as they walked away from the House of Mirrors. The sounds of the fair returned, but it was distorted, almost mocking. They never spoke of what happened inside, and they never saw Jason and Lily again. The House of Mirrors stood silent as they left, its lights flickering ominously in the darkness. For those who entered, the maze was more than just a funhouse. It was a place where fears became reality, and not everyone made it out. As Emma and Mark disappeared into the night, they couldn't shake the feeling that they had left a part of themselves behind in the maze, a part that would remain trapped forever, lost among the twisted reflections. The Ferris wheel had been part of the county fair for as long as anyone could remember. It was old, rusted in places, and creaked ominously with every rotation, but it still drew crowds. For a group of local teens, Sarah, Chris, Emily, and Jake, it was the highlight of the fair, the one ride they never missed. As the fair was winding down for the night, they decided to take one last ride. The operator, a grizzled man with a cigarette hanging from his lips, barely glanced at them as he let them into the carriages. The wheel jerked to life, and they were lifted into the air, the lights of the fairground spreading out beneath them like a sea of color. But as they reached the top, the wheel stopped with a shuddering jolt. The lights flickered, and then the ride was plunged into darkness. "What the hell?" Jake muttered, looking down at the fairgrounds. The people below were moving around, seemingly oblivious to their predicament. "Probably just a power glitch," Chris said, though his voice lacked conviction. Minutes passed, and the wheel remained motionless. The cold wind whipped around them, and the silence became oppressive. What started as a minor inconvenience quickly turned into something more ominous. "We're stuck," Sarah said, her voice tight with fear. Jake banged on the side of the carriage. "Hey, down there, we're stuck up here." No one responded. The fair below continued as if nothing was wrong. Emily wrapped her arms around herself, shivering. "This isn't right. Why isn't anyone helping us?" Tension began to build among the group. Sarah and Emily huddled together, while Chris and Jake tried to come up with a plan. But there was little they could do at that height, and the feeling of helplessness started to seep in. As time dragged on, the temperature dropped, and the reality of their situation began to set in. They were alone, trapped in the sky with no way down. The darkness seemed to close in around them, amplifying their fears. Old grudges and unresolved conflicts began to surface. Sarah and Jake, who had been dating on and off for years, started to bicker, their frustration with the situation bleeding into their personal issues. Chris, usually the peacemaker, found himself caught between them, trying to keep everyone calm but struggling with his own rising panic. Emily, the quietest of the group, was the first to break down. She started crying, the stress and fear overwhelming her. Sarah tried to comfort her, but her own nerves were frayed, and it wasn't long before she snapped at Emily, telling her to pull it together. Hours passed. The fair below started to close down, the lights dimming, the crowds thinning out. The group's isolation became more pronounced as the night grew darker. Finally, Chris decided they couldn't just sit there waiting. He suggested trying to climb down, but the idea was quickly shot down by the others. It was too dangerous, especially in the dark. Jake, growing increasingly frustrated, accused Chris of being too passive, of always avoiding risks. The argument escalated, and soon all four of them were shouting at each other, their fear and frustration boiling over. In the heat of the moment, Jake did something reckless. He tried to climb out of the carriage, insisting that they couldn't just wait to be rescued. But as soon as he shifted his weight, the carriage tilted dangerously, and Sarah screamed for him to get back inside. Jake hesitated, his bravado wavering. But then the carriage jerked again and he lost his grip. The others could only watch in horror as he slipped and fell, his scream cutting through the night air. The silence that followed was deafening. They were in shock, unable to process what had just happened. Emily was sobbing uncontrollably, while Chris and Sarah stared blankly into the darkness, their minds reeling. It felt like an eternity before the Ferris wheel started moving again, slowly descending toward the ground. The operator was nowhere to be seen when they finally disembarked, and the fairgrounds were deserted, the once lively atmosphere now eerily silent. As they stumbled away from the Ferris wheel, the weight of what had happened pressed down on them. There would be questions, investigations, and blame. But in that moment, all they could think about was the empty space where Jake should have been. The fair had always been a place of fun and excitement, but now it was tainted by the memory of that night. They would never look at the Ferris wheel, or each other, the same way again. The county fair was long past closing time when Mike, Jenny, Tom, and Beth snuck back in. The thrill of breaking the rules had always been their favorite pastime, but tonight had a different edge to it. Something darker. "Look at that," Mike whispered, pointing to an old ride hidden at the back of the fairgrounds. It was a rusty, creaking contraption, long since abandoned and half hidden by overgrown weeds. "That thing's ancient," Jenny said, her voice tinged with both awe and apprehension. "It wasn't even open earlier." "Exactly," Mike grinned. "Who knows how long it's been here? We have to check it out." Beth hesitated, glancing around nervously. "Maybe we should just go home. This place is giving me the creeps." "Come on, Beth," Tom said, nudging her playfully. "What's the worst that could happen?" Reluctantly, Beth followed the others as they approached the ride. The closer they got, the more unsettling it became. The metal was rusted and covered in strange stains, and the seats were torn and tattered. An eerie silence hung in the air, as if the ride itself was holding its breath, waiting. They were about to climb in when a figure stepped out from the shadows, a tall, gaunt man with hollow eyes and a crooked grin. His presence was as unsettling as the ride itself, and he moved with a slow, deliberate gait that made the group instinctively step back. "Looking for a thrill, are we?" the man rasped, his voice like nails on a chalkboard. "We didn't mean to." Beth started, but Mike interrupted her. "Yeah, we are. What's it to you?" The man's grin widened, revealing yellowed teeth. "This old ride hasn't seen any action in years, but for you kids I might just fire it up one last time." Jenny felt a shiver run down her spine. "Is it safe?" The man's eyes gleamed in the dim light. "Safe? Nothing's safe in life, sweetheart. But that's what makes it fun, isn't it?" Mike, always eager to prove himself, stepped forward. "We'll do it." Beth grabbed his arm. "Mike, don't. This doesn't feel right." But Mike shook her off. "Come on, Beth. Don't be such a wimp." The man gestured toward the ride, and the group, despite their better judgment, climbed into the creaking seats. The man moved to an old, rusted control panel, his bony fingers hovering over the levers. "Hold on tight," he warned, pulling a lever with a groan. The ride jolted to life, the seats rattling as the machinery struggled to work after years of neglect. At first it was slow, the ride moving in jerky, uneven circles. But as the seconds passed, it began to pick up speed, faster and faster, until the wind whipped past their faces and the fairground lights became a blur. "What the hell?" Tom shouted over the noise. "This is crazy," Jenny tried to scream, but the sound was torn from her lips by the wind. The ride was spinning out of control, the seats lurching violently with every rotation. The bolts holding the seats to the ride began to strain and creak, some of them snapping under the pressure. Beth clung to her seat, her knuckles white. "We have to get off. Mike, we have to get off." But there was no stopping the ride. The man watched from the control panel, his twisted grin never wavering as the ride spun faster, the seats rocking dangerously. One of the belts securing them began to tear, the fabric fraying with every jerk and twist. Panic set in as the ride became more violent. Mike, now realizing his mistake, tried to reach for the latch to release his seatbelt, but the force of the ride held him back. "Stop this thing," he screamed, but the man didn't move. Tom's seat began to tilt, the bolts groaning under the pressure. "I'm slipping," he shouted, his voice laced with terror. The others could only watch in horror as his seat gave way, sending him crashing into the metal railings with a sickening thud. Blood splattered across the rusted metal, and his body slumped, motionless. Jenny screamed, a primal, terrified sound that echoed through the night. Beth was sobbing, her tears flying off her face as the ride continued its deadly spin. Mike struggled against the force, desperately trying to free himself, but it was no use. The ride was out of control, and the man at the controls seemed to be enjoying every second of their terror. The ride lurched again, and Jenny's seatbelt snapped, sending her flying into the darkness. The others could hear her scream fade into the distance, cut short by a horrifying silence. Beth clung to her seat, praying for it to stop, but the ride showed no signs of slowing down. Mike, his face pale with fear, turned to her. "Beth, I'm sorry." Before he could finish, the ride gave one final violent shake, and his seat tore free from the frame, sending him crashing to the ground below. Beth's scream was lost in the wind as she was thrown against the side of the ride, her body slamming into the metal with bone-crushing force. Finally, mercifully, the ride began to slow, the creaking machinery groaning as it came to a stop. The man at the control panel pulled the lever back, his expression unreadable. He watched as the ride's last remaining passenger, Beth, slumped in her seat, barely conscious, her body battered and broken. With a satisfied nod, the man turned and disappeared into the shadows, leaving the ride to creak softly in the night air. The fairground was silent, save for the distant hum of electricity and the faint echo of a girl's sobs, lost among the twisted metal and shattered dreams of one final deadly ride.